In other news now, just in the nick of time, the U.S. Congress rushes through the final passage of a bipartisan deal temporarily allowing a government shutdown to be avoided. Well, the drama this time around came after the increasingly influential business tycoon Elon Musk published a series of tweets railing against a first bipartisan proposal, resulting in its failure. But in a rather curious development, the bill that ultimately passed is almost the same as the one that failed, except that it scraps a 2-year suspension of the country's self-imposed borrowing limit, and this as demanded by President-elect Donald Trump. For more on this, Dr. Andrew Smith joins me on the program. He's director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center and professor of practice in political science. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Well, even though it hasn't actually happened since 2019, it seems like the U.S. has kind of been dealing with the risk of a shutdown almost every year since then. What makes this episode different than others?
This one's a little curious because we don't really have a battle between Congress and the White House, which is the normal thing. President Biden has been noticeably absent from any of the negotiations that were going on here. It's essentially the new president who has the incoming president that was doing the negotiations with his own party. So that's one thing I think that really made this different. And it's a time in which both houses of Congress are very closely divided. So there really aren't enough votes that the leadership of either the Democratic-controlled Senate or the Republican-controlled House can afford to give up in these sorts of votes. So it was quite a different situation this time. But I have to say that it's still the kind of kabuki theater that the United States goes through every time we come up against a debt limit or a funding limit like this. We haven't been very strategic, I should say, in our budgeting process for many, many, many years now, both in Republican and Democratic administrations and Democratic and Republican control of Congress.
It's indeed almost become somewhat of a holiday, a tradition, if you could call it that. Now, on top of what you just said there, this has also revealed what could be a growing division among Republicans, those who are sticking with the more traditionally conservative goal of slashing spending, cutting debt, and those who are still considered to be on the right, but who now support raising the federal debt limit, including, most importantly, President-elect Donald Trump. How do you explain this kind of break with the classic Republican tradition?
Well, Republicans have used that debt limit as a way to try to control spending by within the United States, and it hasn't been particularly effective. I think that Trump and the Trump-backed Republicans really want to get rid of the debt limit as an issue that has to come up every few years when we bump up against our borrowing limit. The United States is quite unusual compared to other countries in having both money that can be spent, but also a debt limit. Most countries don't have a debt limit. It's just part of the same practice of acquiring funds for the country. But I think that the fact that that was dropped is something that I think Democrats actually supported this time, because now they have an opportunity to use the debt limit as a weapon against Donald Trump. So there's a lot of politicking going on here. People are already lining up for the 2026 midterm elections. So we can't forget that the political pressures that are both being faced by people within Congress and people who are hoping to control Congress after 2026.
Well, speaking of that politicking, as you call it, Professor, some 38 Republicans refused to vote for the spending deal that Donald Trump pushed for. Do you see this as potentially the beginning of the end of some of the GOP unity that we've seen since Donald Trump rose to the head of the party?
Well, I don't really think that we've seen that kind of unity. We've seen kind of threats on the part of the Trump-backed Republicans to keep the other Republicans in line. But I think this is going to be a really unusual session for Congress because Republicans have very, very narrow majorities in the incoming Congress. So these sorts of things are going to be down to even a personal level, personal animosities between leadership and members of Congress, people who can hold Congress hostage because all it's going to take is a loss of a few Republican votes for the Republicans to be unable to pass things through the House or the Senate. So I think that this represents more than just divisions between Trump-backed Republicans and more traditional Republicans, but just the various factions that are there naturally within any legislative body, even among parties. So I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of unity going forward. On some big issues there will be, but obviously the devil's in the details here, and we're going to see a lot of details being fought over.
Well, this has also revealed perhaps the depth of Elon Musk's influence on the president-elect. He's increasingly portrayed as the person who could be pulling the strings. Do you think that the relationship between he and Donald Trump is sustainable, both from the perspective of both of those men, but also because of some of the divisions that it might help fuel within the Republican Party?
Well, I'd be cautious to see about how much influence anybody has with Donald Trump. He's really been kind of seen as somebody who takes his own advice, maybe to his detriment. The Musk's influence, I think, he was obviously helpful in getting Trump elected. But I think Trump will say, "Well, you're elected. I'll give you something to do. Try to reform government. A thankless task at that." And I think that I don't see that these divisions being played out as importantly as the press does. I think that Musk's influence will largely dissipate as time goes on because Trump's concerned about Trump's influence, not somebody else's.
As a final question for you, Dr. Andrew Smith, as an expert in public opinion research, how do you think that all of this is going to be perceived by Republican voters? Is this what they voted for when they chose Trump, be it the bickering about the budget or the outsized presence, even if you, as you suggest, it doesn't maybe have that much of an influence, of billionaires like Elon Musk?
Uh, I think voters largely don't pay attention to these things. We've had so many of these government shutdowns and threats of government shutdowns over the last several decades that they're kind of unimportant, frankly, to most voters. When you ask people about these kind of questions, they basically line up with their parties, obviously, against the opposing party, and they don't really look at those divisions within the parties as important. I think that this is a story that's going to be forgotten by next week until we have that March 15th deadline for the next budget shutdown that we're going to face. And then we'll be back in this same soup again.
We'll wait and see. Dr. Andrew Smith, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.